Similarly, thrift is common. If you aren't thrifty, you starve. That's the way it is. If you're a peasant or a farmer, you eat your corn and you have nothing to plant. Now she makes a very interesting point that thrift does not imply investment opportunities. And so she claims that, I wasn't aware of this, but she claims that in England, they showed relatively less investment in physical capital around 1700 compared to other countries. But investment actually rose because opportunities rose. So that gave people more of a reason to be thrifty and to invest. And I also want to mention the point about conquest. While it does make sense that a lot of conquerors certainly did do well, a lot of the English nabobs would plunder a lot. There's a lot of people, I'm sure, made a lot of money from the slave trade and a lot of money from rum and piracy and all of those things. But while those individuals might have done well, it didn't necessarily do that much for society as a whole. And in a lot of ways, you could say that conquest is a symptom. The reason it wasn't 19th century imperialism did not make those countries rich. It was because those countries were so rich and powerful that they were able to, without even really trying, conquer almost the entire world in the 19th century, and then they then subsequently lost it as things changed. So, and a good way to look at this is the line about Robin Hood. Why would anyone steal from the poor anyway? They don't have any money. So the next section would be on why is innovation so important for past and future progress. So I think one thing which is really important is the idea of marginal utility. It's a concept in economics, and that you have diminishing returns. So an easy way to illustrate marginal utility is that if you don't have a car or a bicycle or any way to get around, the first one you have creates a vast improvement in your life. You can now get around easily and so on. But if you get a second car, well, there's actually diminishing returns. Each additional item has less utility, and that's because you can only drive one car at a time. So it doesn't actually make you can't actually get around faster because you have two cars, so you can only use one at a time. And so without innovation, what happens is that we have diminishing returns. So a good example would be, let's say you're a farmer and you can get more horses, but you still only have so much time in the day, and those horses, after a certain point, aren't going to help you do any work any more faster. So you need things like reapers and tractors, and those will actually allow you to be more productive per hour. And she also means by innovation entrepreneurship, organization, and methods, not just material capital. And so there's a quote, she talks about how investment in the same old agricultural technology is not going to get you the same returns as innovating in clay pipe under drainage and plant breeding and forward markets and mechanical reapers and experimental stations and diesel tractors and rail car delivery systems and hybrid corn and farm cooperatives and chemical herbicides. So those innovations are going to have a lot more impact than having more horses or having more manual sickles. And so we've seen today that in the US, for example, very few agricultural workers are needed, but they're able to export food just fine. And other examples would be autos, even though they're an old technology, have actually seen a lot of changes. Autos last a lot longer, they're a lot easier to drive, etc. So we've seen continuing innovation there. And then the most obvious one is computers. Everyone's very aware of just how much more powerful they are, how much more they can do, and a lot of people probably heard Moore's Law, which is that the processing power doubles every 18 months. So there we see constant innovation, and that allows people to have things like iPhones and iPads. And she makes the point that during the Industrial Revolution, I haven't looked into this, but she says that cloth actually saw a similar speed of innovation, that things were constantly improving initially. And also, but that innovation has actually continued if you look at the way that a lot of people now have tons of clothes, probably have to throw out clothes because they get too many of them. There was an interesting article on Mises.org too, talking about Japan over the last 20 years and how people think of it as a lost decade, but one of the things which is a lot of ordinary people have actually seen a lot of improvements over the last 20 years. There's been they're able to access and import better stuff. They're able to, the quality of the products in their stores are better. But also the capital equipment is better. So you think about the flat screen TVs which people were able to produce. The TV companies were continually replacing their capital equipment, but they were getting better and better capital equipment, which was able to produce larger and larger flat screens. So even though it might seem like their capital base wasn't increasing because they had maybe the same number of machineries, or they were replacing their machinery with what seemed to be the same stuff, it was actually producing a much, much better product. So now, even with a high import tax, a lot of people here can afford a fairly large flat screen TV. So anyway, it's a very good article to look at. So her big point in this is that it's great to be bourgeois, and we want to keep that. And she also says that if we want to maintain our role today, the really big thing is we need to be able to keep the innovation, that we can withstand, some degree of social democracy. As long as we can keep innovating, things can continue to get better, and we can, my terms, I guess, we can afford the parasite, which is the state. And another interesting example, she doesn't bring up, but Hans Hermann Hoppe wrote a great book on socialism and capitalism, and he talks about the example of Scandinavia, and a lot of people think of Scandinavia as having always been this amazing social democracy and welfare state, but he makes the point that while it's true that they had those things, and while that might have changed, it hadn't changed by the time of that book. The thing there was that if you paid your taxes, you could basically do whatever you want from a businessman's perspective. So and to fit into McCloskey's paradigm, you could innovate very freely. But you compare it to places like Italy, especially, and France, and where in a lot of these areas they had very restrictive laws on whether or not you could open a business, whether or not you could have new products. There were price controls, there were all these different things, all these different rules and regulations, which made it very hard to innovate, to have a business, and to be productive. So even though it might have seemed that they might have not had taxes, and you probably know the Italians and the French are very good at evading taxes. But so that was kind of Hoppe's contrast, was that they were able to afford that system in Sweden because they actually had a very free economy, and outside of the taxes they had to pay. Okay, so that's kind of talking about. Hopefully this makes sense as to why innovation is important. And so the next big thing is, okay, so what's her explanation for innovation? How do we already talked about how all these other things have been the same. We've had imperialism and wars, and we've had people who have had to be thrifty and accumulate capital. So for her, it was a change in rhetoric led to innovation. The bourgeois was given dignity and liberty through rhetoric and language. So this is to say that there was a new perception, and the social and legal pressure on people was lifted. There was more opportunity. So kind of try to contrast things. So I guess to give an example of dignity is, look at the way Steve Jobs was treated when he died. Sure, some people did complain about him, but in general, a lot of people really admire the guy. I think he's amazing. I think he's a hero. He had a great vision, and I actually read the Playboy interview he gave back in the 80s, and he's a young man. He was about to get kicked out of Apple, I think, at that point. But he knew that the internet was coming, and he knew that he had to have that he wanted to be able to make what he ended up making, and he knew that he's had that vision, and he stuck with it, and I think made it a reality. And once the technology caught up, I think he's a pretty amazing guy myself. So the old way of doing things was that there was not a lot of respect for the bourgeois. There was not a lot of respect, especially for merchants. People didn't understand the idea that you could buy something at one price and then sell it at a higher price. That didn't make any sense. It seemed like obviously you're cheating. But there was also, I think, a zero-sum mentality, which is that if you think about it, it makes sense. You can only have so many cattle out in the field. You can only have so many plants coming up. The crops can only be so large that year. So, you have to divide things fairly. So that makes sense. But there was another very important thing, and Hume, the philosopher, has a great quote. Around 1750, he said in his work, Political Discourses, He contrasts the monarchical system, by which he means France, and he contrasts it with England. So commerce, therefore, in my opinion, is apt to decay in absolute governments. Not because it is less secure, but because it is less honorable. So he thought it was kind of ridiculous to say that in France that people weren't really secure. Sure, there were all sorts of rules and so on like that, but the government didn't actually run around taking your money away or taking your property away. It might force you to act within certain rules, but you were fairly secure. And so the contrast is that it is less honorable there, even compared to England, which was still fairly class-bound and continues to be so. And there's a great expression, throne and altar, which describes the old conservative unstandard regime, where the paths to advancement were towards the throne and the altar. So you wanted to be a soldier, you wanted to be in the clergy, you wanted to, I mentioned that already, but you wanted to be a bureaucrat or maybe a lawyer, or obviously it was great if you were noble, that would be probably the best thing to start off with. But that was, if you were a talented person, that was the way to go, and outside of that, it wasn't very honorable, and it was looked down upon. And she has a ton of material about that in there, about how things are different. And one thing which she does talk to, which is very important to think about, or very interesting to think about, is the way in which our words have changed over time. Some of us are aware of this, but sometimes we forget. So a good example is the word honest. So honest used to refer to honor, in the sense of a nobleman, not so much telling the truth. Now, of course, if you read Nietzsche, he'll tell you that only noble people were truthful in the old way. But really, the emphasis was on the person who was, I guess, probably they were more truthful in the sense that they were willing to fight and they were willing to stand up and not and protest against something. But this was a big change. But the bourgeois sense of honest is really about, oh, you're a truthful person, you don't cheat people, etc. It's a very different emphasis. And so our language, we can actually see a lot of changes. And so that's an example of how dignity has changed. Okay, so to try to summarize what the big change was again. So there was dignity of going into trade and invention. This was combined with liberty to innovate and to trade freely internally. And I think she makes an interesting point that it's kind of dignity came first. There was a new perception. And if you have dignity, your liberty is more likely to be respected. Unfortunately, we can see this all the time in the way that people are prosecuted by the courts. If they're tried in the court of public opinion and they can be made to look like a bad guy, their rights are probably not going to be respected, unfortunately. And Macaulay also makes a point about how in a lot of societies, if something is considered a vice, if an activity is considered a vice, it's usually pursued more viciously in that society, whereas an activity in another place is not considered a vice, it usually has less bad effects on the people conducting it. And McCloskey also talks about people will tend to, if they are in a dignified profession, they'll tend to act dignified as well. So if they think they're supposed to be honest, then they'll want to be an honest merchant. Whereas if all merchants are assumed to be crooks, then they'll be more likely to try to cheat people. So that was a big change. And so the paths to respectability lead not just narrowly to throne and altar. And a good example is the engineer Brunel. Being an American, I didn't really hear about him growing up. But in 2002, they conducted a poll in England of the 100 greatest Britons. And Brunel was an engineer. He was the son of French immigrants. And he came in number 2.